Okay, let's get started. Today, good news is we're not going to do anything in Node, so there won't be anything on the command line, at least until the very end if you really want to. That'll be an extra thing, but today we are going to work entirely in the client. Doesn't mean you're going to understand it, but it does mean at least that there will be a lower level of complexity that we have to deal with. So today what we're going to work with is Backbone. And what Backbone does is it gives us a way of structuring our client-side code so that it has a little bit more order, right? If you are building a website and you are just adding like little jQuery elements, right? Like little interactive bits here and there. I want to make a drop-down menu. I want to maybe have a slider. I'm going to do tabs, that I can pick. Then that's fine, right? You don't really need a lot of structure to that. There's not a lot of complexity. You can just write a little script that gets included on every page and it's fine. But once we start thinking about applications that do real work, right? Applications that need to track data and then show you that data, keep track of changes, re-render when it changes, be able to persist that to the server. So all of the things that we've been talking about doing that would be supported by Happy.js or anything that allows for really complicated interaction without refreshing the page. Anything where the server stops being the thing that does the vast majority of the interaction, we need to start structuring our code. Because otherwise what you end up with is a very long script file that basically contains in arbitrary random order lots of event listeners. Those event listeners are hooked together. Maybe they're applied to variables somehow, but there's not really a direction. Right? It just turns into spaghetti. And so what happened is people had different ways of structuring programs for a long time, right? Yahoo was an original pioneer of this. The Dojo toolkit had ideas of like, this is how you should structure an application so that it's sustainable and it can grow to be very large without becoming a 4,000 line script file. But one of the ones that really took off was Backbone. And it was originally created by a person named Jeremy Ashkenas, who worked at the New York Times. And he was a big Ruby coder. And Ruby, for all of its faults, and specifically Ruby on Rails, has a very strong MVC point of view, right? It really wants you to organize your code strongly to the point where when you create a new Rails project, it actually creates the folder structure, and that is standard for Rails projects, right? There's none of this wishy-washy, hippie, create your own folders crap in Rails. Like Rails says, these are the conventions we will follow. That will make it easier for people to work together on a project because we will all know the state of affairs that we're in. And Backbone was an attempt to bring that kind of structure to the browser so that whereas previously I might write an application and mine might be a lot of functional programming. So there's a lot of like maps and reduces and passing data around and immutable objects. And somebody else might write it with a lot of inheritance, and somebody else might write it with just a bunch of free variables and they're just like mixing jQuery in there. Instead, we standardize. We say, look, we're going to use this framework. It's going to provide models and views. The controller is kind of off in the distance somewhere. It's not really a strong part of Backbone. But we're going to have this framework for it. This is how we build our stuff. This is how the pieces connect together. You're not going to make it up. You're going to have a real way that you say, this is how a piece of the page relates to data. This is how we change the data. And this is what triggers the page changing. So Backbone is a strong kind of like place for us to start with that. To do so, we are actually going to start a little bit lower on the stack. So we're going to talk a lot about MVC today. We've covered it a little bit. I'm going to share my screen real quick. But really one of the things that we want to talk about at the start is we want to discuss not only MVC pattern, but we need to talk about something more fundamental, which is client-side templating. So what I'd like you to do right now is we're going to go to CDN.js. I promised you that we wouldn't need to start up a server or worry about a lot of resources, and I was not kidding. So this is a service that lets you load JavaScript libraries from a common fast CDN so that you don't have to download them. which is handy, right? Like they all come from the same place. So you're going to search for two things. First, you're going to search for jQuery. We're going to go ahead and load jQuery onto our page. And you can copy this link, but if you do, when you search for jQuery, make sure that you add HTTP : in front of it. We're going to load our files off the hard drive. We're not going to start them with a server, and that means that this URL is not valid unless we tell it that this file comes off the network. So I'm going to start my page here, doc type HTML. Adam decided to freeze for a second. I hope that's not permanent. Cool. And then inside of my HTML page, I'm going to add my body. And at the bottom of my body, that's where I put my script tag with a source of HTTP : and I paste in my script. Save this to my hard drive as index.html on my desktop. Does anyone know, why is it, I hope some of you know, why do we put the script tags at the bottom of the body tag? This should be really basic stuff for those of you that have had me before. Yeah?
So that keep doing everything else.
Right. So when we load a page and it hits JavaScript, the browser freezes. It does not execute anything else on the page. It halts the page completely. It doesn't show anything else because JavaScript can technically rewrite anything, right? You can use, you shouldn't, but you can use document write to change the page. The whole thing becomes mutable. It's all up in the air at that point. So whenever it sees a script tag, the browser completely stops. If you put your scripts in the head of the page, and then your page stalls, right? If the place where you're getting your script, it halts, then nothing shows up on the page because your browser's waiting for that script to download and nothing else gets shown because it's halted. If you put it at the bottom, it's still not going to work, but your user sees something and it feels faster instead of feeling very slow because it's halted on a white screen. So we always put our scripts at the bottom of the body tag. So we've loaded jQuery. The other thing we're going to go to CDN.js and look for is we're going to look for a library called Lodash, Lodash.js. Lodash is a requirement of, it's a thing that's required for Backbone. Backbone technically requires underscore, but Lodash is a drop-in replacement for underscore, so we can use it in place of it. So I'm going to say script source. There's my Lodash script. Cool. So now I've got both of those in my page. I've got jQuery. I've got Lodash. I'm feeling pretty good about myself. And while you guys are doing that, I'm just going to, I always like to add a head tag. Wow, Adam added this like crazy autocomplete thing. It's kind of driving me nuts, actually. Title, hello, Backbone. Turn that off. Assuming there's a way to turn it off. There we go. Cool. Excellent. Cool. Okay. So once we have these two things on the page, we're going to add two more script tags, but they're going to be a little bit different. So one of them is going to be the script tag where we're going to write our scripts. But the first one is going to be a script tag that we're going to use to put a template on the page. So when we've worked with Happy, it has a place where templates go, and then the framework like finds them, and when you call for a view, it loads them off the hard drive and it returns that template. But in the browser, we need a way to get to templates, and we don't just want to stick them in the page because then we have all this like placeholder content. We have to figure out how to hide them. Like that's kind of awful. If your CSS doesn't load, they show up. The easiest way to hide a template is to put it in a script tag with a type that is not JavaScript. So if you say type text HTML, nothing that you put inside this script tag will run as JavaScript, but it also won't show up on the page. So by putting it in this tag, we have hidden it from our browser. And in Atom, actually, if the type is text HTML, you'll even get like nice HTML syntax highlighting, which is great, right? I can sit here and I can say div, and it still looks like HTML because Atom knows that a script tag named like this, I'm writing HTML inside of it. I'm not writing JavaScript. So I'm going to, inside of my script, I'm going to do two things. I'm going to give it an ID. I'm going to say the ID for this is hello template. And then inside my div, I'm going to write my template. It's going to look a little bit different from the handlebars templates that we've used so far, because this is Lodash templating. It's a different template engine, but the concepts are the same. So if I say hello, comma, name, these are the equivalents of the double mustaches in Mustache or in Handlebars, right? So when I write this, it's the same as writing name. And it should look very familiar, right? This is very similar to the way that PHP echo statements look, right? Like if I just replace these percentage signs with question marks, all of a sudden it looks like PHP. So it's not a hard kind of templating to use. It's just a little bit different. We've put our template into the page, and if we load it right now, there shouldn't be anything going on, right? Like there's nothing on this page. We're totally cool. Now let's add a script tag underneath these other, and we're going to actually pull that template into our JavaScript. So underneath both of my imports, underneath my jQuery and my Lodash, I'm going to create a script tag here that is actually going to be where I write my JavaScript. Yep, so this is the very last script tag on the page. It's the last script tag because the order is important, right? Before I use Lodash templating, I have to load Lodash. And before I get the template out of the page, because I'm working with elements, I want to load jQuery because that's a lot easier than working with the DOM directly. I was really tempted to make you guys use the DOM directly, but I decided that was perverse. And so we're just going to use jQuery. It's just easier. Screw it. Okay. So to work with the template contents, we're going to get it out of the page, which means that we are going to select that template. We're going to say template script is equal to, and what's the selector that I would use in jQuery to find that? The ID, right? So I could say hello template, and that will get me the elements. Everybody here has used jQuery, right? I don't have any jQuery noobs. You're all good. I would hope. Because if you've all taken a JavaScript class and you don't know jQuery, then we got some serious issues. All right. Once I've got the script element, I need to get its contents. Who remembers in jQuery, what do I use to get the insides, to get or set the inside of an element? Yeah, I don't know who said that, but it's the HTML function, right? So I can say var contents, or actually let's just say HTML is equal to template script.html. And if you were to log this out, so if you log out the HTML variable, you should see the text that you typed into that script. So I'm going to go back to I'm going to open my page on the desktop. I'll come back to it, don't worry. And if I open up my DevTools, then when I look at the console, after it finishes loading stuff off the network, which is super slow here, which is fun, right? That's enjoyable. Great. Let's try that again. Okay, cool. So after it loaded, right, it spat out to the console. This is the text that was inside my script tag. So I can get access to the stuff that is inside that script tag it will come out in the page. Now, what I want to do now is I want to take that HTML and I want to turn it into a function. And that function will be a function that when I call it and I pass it data, it fills in the blanks. So this is the part that Happy kind of does for you. When you call reply.view and you call that function, you tell it which template to use, and then you pass in an object that fills in the blanks in your template. It's doing both sides of this for you. We're going to do it kind of manually, but it's not hard. So we're going to say, oh, I know what's going on. I didn't put my HTTP in front of that. That makes sense. That would do it. So I'm going to say var template, because this is actually my template function, is equal to, and I'm going to use the underscore variable. So the same way that jQuery creates a $sign variable, Lodash creates an underscore variable. Those are the two like special characters that you're allowed to have in variable names. And they both got claimed very early on by these libraries. I'm going to say, I'm going to use the template function, and I'm going to pass it the HTML that I pulled out. Yes, underscore dot template, because template is a function along with all of the other functions that are available on the underscore object. So underscore provides actually a huge number of utility functions, right? It can bind things, it can do map and reduce, it can pluck things out of an array based on a comparison, it can sort on an object property for you. Like, it's a great library. But one of the things it does is it provides this templating. So I called underscore dot template, I passed in my HTML, and the result here, this var template, is a function. When I call this function, it will fill in, it will return HTML. So I might say var output is equal to calling the template function, and I'm going to pass in an object, and that object's going to have a name property, and I'm going to put Thomas. Some white space in here, really get this broken up a little bit. And we'll log that out. So the function that I created when I compiled my template into a function, when I call that function and I pass in an object, that object is used to fill in the blanks wherever I put those tags. And so if you've done this, the output variable, once it actually like runs, instead of saying hello and having the template code, it's going to fill that in. And it's going to say, in my case, it will say, hello, Thomas. For you, I don't know what it says. Whatever you type in is the name. That's a little weird.
Oh, he was just using that.
Oh, yeah. So you can see here, this is how you do by hand what Happy does for you. Don't you feel great that it does that for you? But now you know how the sausage is made, right? We load the HTML. It doesn't technically matter where we load it from, right? Like Happy, it comes off the hard drive, and they use the async, the node, like the FS module to read that file. Here we're getting it out of the DOM. So we're using jQuery to select it and then get its contents. Oh no, Adam, why would you? And then we use this function to compile it into its own function. And all this function does is insert data into that HTML and return it. That's all it does. So that when we call it here on line 22, and we provide an object with stuff that goes into it, it fills in the blanks. So this Lodash templating, we're going to use it here today because it's kind of nice. It's nice to use these templates with Backbone. Like a lot of the examples you're going to find, Backbone was meant to be used with underscore and Lodash. One or the other, they're interchangeable. And so that means that a lot of the examples you see are going to be using underscore or Lodash templates, which have these particular kind of delimiters. But you can use handlebars with Backbone. Backbone actually does not care at all, as we'll see, which template engine you use. And so one of the things that's really useful about this is the same templates that you use here, you can also be using on the back end, and you can share your templates between the client and the server. They can be the same template. You just have to get it to the client somehow so that your application can use it. That means that you can send me a complete HTML page, and then your client-side JavaScript upgrades it and starts re-rendering it and makes it live. But people who have JavaScript disabled, or people who first load the page and then they're waiting for the JavaScript to load because they're on a slow connection, they still see everything. And you didn't have to write those templates twice. So today we'll be using Lodash for our templates. We won't be using it extensively, but if you want to use handlebars, maybe toward the end of class, we'll grab that off CDNJS and we'll see how we could change this to make that work instead. Okay? 90% of this actually ends up being the same with handlebars as it is with the Lodash templates. So this is our templating. This is how we output views. And this is a huge sea change in the way that most people think about client-side JavaScript, right? Most of the time when you're thinking about, I'm writing a site with jQuery, the way that you change the page is you select things and then you call like HTML or text to update them. Or you might add classes or remove classes. You do that all manually. So you're constantly selecting stuff. And if you need to change a bunch of things, you have to manually go through and create that. But obviously with templates, it's a lot easier, and especially since templates give us loops, right? If I need to render out a list and then update that list, if you think about any social network that you've used where like your Facebook feed gets new items all the time, your Twitter feed gets new items at the top, they are not sending HTML from the server and injecting it into the page. They are sending just the data, and then the JavaScript is rendering that to create new stuff, but it's using templates because they don't want to have to manually construct all of those elements. And they also don't want to put all of their HTML into their JavaScript. We want to keep those two things separate for all of the reasons that we've talked about in class before, right? We don't want to mix our HTML and our JavaScript code. That creates something that's harder to maintain and it's harder to collaborate on. So, any questions about our templates so far? They're pretty straightforward. The only thing I actually think that'll catch you up is this delimiter syntax is different, right? So instead of using the double mustaches, we use the angle bracket, %, equals, and then the variable name, and then %, angle bracket to close it. There is a lot of documentation on how these templates work, if you're curious, on the Lodash site. So if you were to go to, which is linked from today's lesson, if you were to go to lodash.com, in the API documentation, here on the left, we can actually find, it's down here in the string methods. Here's template. Lodash.com, yes. There we go. And so it has a bunch of examples where they're feeding it HTML directly, but it talks about it does escaping. It can run regular JavaScript, right? Lodash templating is actually a full JavaScript that's embedded into the templates. So it's good stuff. All right, so back in our document. So in the documentation, it's going to be on the left-hand side. There's a whole bunch of subsections. Template is in the string section. So you're going to look for string, and then you're going to find template. And when you load that up, okay. So scripts, template, backbone. What we want to do now, what I want to do for class today is, and I will apologize preemptively, those of you who had me for JavaScript last quarter have actually already had a preview of this. We're going to use Backbone to build a simple calculator. So we are going to build a page that works live, and it creates a calculator object and a view, and as you change the numbers, it pays attention and it re-renders that. But we won't manually have to go through and say, oh, you clicked this thing, it's time to re-render. Backbone will take care of wiring all that together, and it'll structure it for us. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to you know what? I'm going to save this page as something else, and then I'm going to wipe out my script code real quick. So I'm going to make this index 2, and then I want to get rid of this, and I want to get rid of the template that I've put in so far. We're going to put a new template in momentarily. Probably did. You're going to only get rid of the script that you wrote. You're going to keep the 2 script embeds. And I'm going to resave this as, you can save this index 2 or index. I'm keeping it as index in here. Cool. All right. And I'm going to have to load one more script onto the page. So we've got jQuery. We've got Lodash. The last thing we need, clearly, is Backbone, right? So back on CDN.js, go to that search box, type in Backbone, and grab your link. Script source equals HTTP Backbone. It doesn't technically matter which order you put Lodash and jQuery, but they both have to come before you load Backbone. Backbone needs to be the last script that you put on the page, or this won't work. Because it depends on those other 2. It can work without jQuery, but if it doesn't see jQuery on the page before it loads, it will just be like, okay, I'm loading in no jQuery mode, right? It'll assume that that's not a thing. And Lodash it must have on the page before you use it, otherwise it won't work. Cool. So let's talk about models. The idea of a model, I'm going to go back to my, yes, cool, here we go. So the idea of models, when we're programming, the idea of model view controller in the first place, is that when I am writing an application, I want to separate my data from my view, right? So I've got on the one case, I've got like business logic. So in the case of my calculator, this is keeping track of some values, right? So I need to know what is the value of the current total. I need to know what the user has input. I need to be able to add and subtract and do all that other math. Maybe there's other stuff that the calculator does, but none of this is presentational. This is all just the machinery of how the calculator works. You could have a calculator that runs on the command line. You could have a calculator that runs in a browser. You could have one that runs as a native application, but they would all have to do these same things. So this is your business logic. It doesn't matter how it's presented to you, right? It could be on the command line in a web page. As skywriting, it still has to do these things, and you could write this exactly the same way. The other part of it is, so that's the model. And so our model is a mix of our data, and it's the way that we interact with that data. It's not anything that has to do with appearance. Anything that has to do with appearance goes into our view. And so when we talk about a calculator view, it depends on where we're going to put it, but in our case, it goes into a web page, and so that means that it needs to have a display box where we do our numbers. It needs to have buttons. I don't know why my calculator only has 9 buttons, but it does. It's probably not enough. It needs to remember what the input was. Maybe it has like tape coming off the top, right? There's all kinds of stuff that your calculator could have. It's a solar calculator. It's got your little cells. It doesn't matter, right? Anything that's presentational, this is separate from the business logic. In this case, you could have a calculator that works or doesn't, or is presented here or elsewhere, and this view should not know how to add and subtract. That's not its job. Its job is to do 2 things. One is to present this stuff to you visually, like here's the output. And the second thing is the view takes input from you. So when you press a button, The view knows, oh, you press this button, and it knows how to talk to the model. It doesn't know how to add or subtract, but it tells the model, you need to add or subtract, and then give me back the results so that I can show it. That's how we divide up responsibility in a model view controller framework. Technically, the controller in this is the part that glues the two of these together. In Backbone, there's not a strong controller equivalent. We don't really use, there's no like backbone.controller. We do have backbone.model and backbone.view. So that's how we separate these two things together. We're going to start with the model because the model is kind of the easiest thing to start with in isolation. We're just going to interact with it in the console, which makes things nice and easy, right? Like we're going to treat it at the start as a command line calculator, and then when we add the view, it becomes a page calculator. But the model will stay the same. So we'll start with that. So to create our model, we're going to say var calculator model is equal to backbone.model.extend and an object. So models in Backbone are kind of a default thing. Like you can get a model straight from Backbone and it has built-in stuff. It knows how to do certain things. It knows how to register events. It knows how to get and set stuff. It has defaults, right? There's all this utility stuff that comes with it. But we're not writing a generic model. We're writing a model that does a specific thing. And so we use the extend function to inherit the defaults and customize them for our particular use case. For those of you who understand how inheritance works, and for those of you who particularly know how JavaScript's prototype inheritance works, this sets up the prototype inheritance chain. So you don't have to create the prototype. You don't have to create the constructor manually. It will do all that for you. But we do have to say, I want to take a model and customize it. So we use extend, and then it will set up all of that stuff for us. The inheritance will be properly initialized. And we're going to say that our calculator has some default properties. It has some defaults. So by default, its result is 0 because you haven't done anything yet. And its input is 0 because you haven't typed anything yet. And our calculator also has a function that you can call to make it perform math. And we're going to call it do math. So that's a function. It takes an operation as its argument. And this do math function is what encompasses all of the logic. So everything that the calculator can do is in here, and it depends on the operation. We need to get, so in order to, for example, I'm going to lay this out in pseudocode. We need to get the current value. We need to get the input value. We're going to add or subtract or multiply or divide. And then we are going to set the results. Those are the 4 things that do math needs to do. When we work with models in Backbone, like when we say get the current value, how would you think? Like the current value is the result, right? How would I get the result of this object? This is a trick question, but let's humiliate somebody. How would I get the result on this object? Huh? Dot result? So we're not going to use the defaults. That's just what it initializes for us. That means that if we make a calculator and we don't customize it, it starts at zeros. So it presets those for us. We can't use dot results. In Backbone, we use these wrapper functions to get and set things. So that was tricky. Like you would have no way of knowing that. But if I want, for example, the current value, I might say var value is equal to this dot get results. And likewise, to get the input value, I might say var input is equal to this dot get input. Get and set operates on the same values that were set up when we put them into defaults, but they're not directly on this object. And the reason why they're not directly there is when you get or set things, you can subscribe to know from your view or from another model to say like, hey, has this attribute changed? I want to know when like the result changed, because when the result changes, I need to update my calculator on the view, right? So by calling these if we set it directly, there's no way to let subscribers know that these values have changed because we're just setting it directly. We don't notify them. But when we call this function, Backbone will get or set the results. And then if the result is, or if the value that it's getting or setting is different, it will let subscribers know, hey, by the way, this thing has been updated. So if you need to redraw, you can do that. So that's why we go through these kinds of annoying functions instead of just saying like var value equals this dot result. We have to say dot get result. And if you find yourself working with Backbone and you can't figure out like why aren't things updating on screen, make sure you're not working with properties directly. Maybe you forgot to use get or set, because that would mean that then your view wouldn't know that they've changed. You're not letting it know. Also, you'll get the wrong answer because there is no dot result. All right, inside here, we're going to actually do this math. So for right now, we're just going to support one operation off the top, and then you can always add other operations. I'm going to say if operation is equal to add, then var output is equal to this value plus input. And if you want to add additional ones, right, you can have one for subtraction, one for multiplication. The idea is whatever operation you pass into this function is the operation that it does. So when we call this function, we're going to pass in add, sub, mult, divide, so that we can specify what we want the calculator to do. And then finally, we need to update our calculator. So we're going to say this dot set the result with the value of our output. That's our model, basically in a nutshell. It knows what its current result is, it knows what you've typed, and it knows how to add, and we can teach it very easily to subtract and perform other operations. What we're simulating is one of those calculators where you just like you have a running total, and then you type in a new input and you hit plus and it adds it to the previous, but it does it right away. We don't need to hit equals because that would be additional stuff we'd have to keep track of. So very, very simple calculator right now. All right. Once we've got our calculator model set up, this is just the prototype, right? This is, and you might have multiple models of a certain type. If you were, for example, designing a blog, you might have a post model, right? That you use to say, well, this is a post. It has a title, it has content. I need to know if these things change. But you don't just have one post on a page, you have lots. And so what this function is that we get back from extend is it's a factory function. And to make an actual calculator, not the factory for calculators, we use new. So we can say var calc is equal to a new calculator model. Just like that. So that calls our factory function. Our constructor is the technical term for this thing. A function that creates new objects in JavaScript is a constructor, as it is in lots of other languages. And what makes it a constructor is the new keyword. So if you've never seen this before, this is important, right? You only use new when you are making objects that have been set up as from factory functions. So you only call constructors with new. You don't use new with other things. And if you have a constructor, you must put new in front of it or you will get bugs. So that's the other thing that's really important. Do not ever call calculator model without new in front of it. Don't call any other constructor. If you know how to do JavaScript inheritance, you have to always put new in front of that when you call it. All right, let's take a look at what this, how this works now. So we've saved our page. We're going to go back to our console. So our hello backbone page. And if you type calc, you should see that object, right? And you can see that it's fairly complex, right? There's actually a bunch of stuff that's on it. It has, if you go down the prototype chain, this is the chain of inheritance. So you can see where it's inherited, like the do math function. And from backbone, it's inherited a bunch of these like destroy and escape and fetch, a whole bunch of functions. So our calculator objects has been created, we hope, correctly. Anyone? Okay, cool. All right. Yeah, I'm working in Chrome, but like in Firefox, it's a little moved around. That's fine. Huh? You have some errors? Okay. Okay, so these are if not there, it was before. That's not something. Okay. So we've got our calculator. Let's actually use it. So if I were to change the input, I would want to say calc.set, and I'm going to set the input. So this is as though I had typed a number. I'm going to say calc.set the input, and I'm going to set it equal to 12. And when I call this, it returns the same object. It's not really like nothing really happened. But now if I say calc.do math, and I pass in add, that's going to have done the math, right? And what I should see now is in order to get the result, I can say calc.get result, and the result should have changed to 12. So I set the input, I told it to add those two numbers together, and then I got the result, and the result was 12. If you want to look at a backbone model and you don't want to kind of wade through this whole thing of like getting individual results, one of the things you can do is you can call the toJSON method. And that will give you back all of the things that are its attributes. So in this case, by calling toJSON, I got back the result and the input values. And if I were going to call like do math again, and then toJSON, I would see that the result doubles. So it's a slightly awkward way of working with this object. It's a little frustrating because instead of just saying the input is equal to this, we have to call get and set. We can't just like ask for a value the normal way. We have to call get from it. But let's see what makes this special. Let's see why we're going through all this hassle. We're going to write a listener function. So go back to your source code. And after you say var calc equals new calculator model, you're going to say calc.on change result. And you're going to provide a function. Callback. This is an event listener. So our model fires events whenever it changes, whenever something happens to it. It lets anything that has subscribed to it as an event, it knows about it. And then I'm going to say console.log calc.toJSON. So I'm going to have it log out the attributes of this object. That means that now I have asked my model, I said, listen, anytime your result property changes, and you can just listen for like change events, but we've told it specifically, I want to listen for changes to the result property. Anytime that result changes, call this function. And this function is going to log out your attributes. So it's going to let us see automatically. And if we save that, and then we go back to our browser and we refresh the page again in our DevTools, and we say calc.set the input to 4, calc.doMath add. Hey, look, it automatically logged it out. We did not have to do anything to say log this thing out because it does it for us, right? We told it, look, whenever this changes, log out your values. And since doMath changes the result, now we are subscribed, and that fires an event. So this works the same way that like jQuery can register for events in your browser on Elements. You can register for a click event. You can register for key down or when the window loads. In this case, we're creating our own events. We're saying whenever this thing is updated, let us know. And the reason why that's going to be important is that when we need to redraw this view and update it with the new results, we don't have to manually track, has this object changed, right? We don't have to every single time tell it, hey, I need you to redraw yourself. We can just say, if the model changes, make the view match by re-render. Cool, questions? All right, let's keep powering ahead. So we've got our model. I'm happy with where it is. It's a little cumbersome. That's okay, right? The model's job is not actually to be easy to interact with because that's what our view is for. Our view is what makes it easy to interact with it because it provides buttons and outputs and all that good stuff. So let's start creating a view. And in order to do that, let's make a template. So up here in our body, where we had our hello template, I'm going to make a calc template. So this is a script tag with a type of text HTML and an ID of calc template so that I can get access to it. And inside this template, I'm going to write some HTML. So I'm going to say div class equals output for styling. And I want you to output the results. And then on my next line, I've got my input. And it's, I'm going to give it a class of input. That makes sense. I don't need to template anything with the input because I guess it doesn't really matter. The input is only being used for input, so there's no output there. And then we're going to add a button. This button is going to have a class of operation. And it's going to have a data op attribute of add. And this is a plus button. So that's its label as the plus. Some of you, I hope, are recognizing this pattern because I do this a lot. And it's one of the things that I think is really important to learn. Whether or not you actually use Backbone, like using attributes like this is a great way to guide us through. When we click this button, we're going to need to know, like we don't want to write individual event listeners for every single button. That's really wasteful. I want to have one function that all buttons talk to so that I only have to write my, oh, a button was clicked, I need to do something. I only want to write it once because I never want to repeat myself and I never want to copy and paste. So by adding an attribute to this button that says, hey, which operation are you? I can just get that information when it gets clicked, right? I can just, when the button is clicked, I'll be able to get to the element. I'll be able to say, hey, what was your data op attribute? And data attributes, anything that's data dash is fully supported and should verify. And obviously you guys know that I don't actually care about verification in any, or validation in any way, shape, or form, right? I think validation is crap. But if you care about validation, these are HTML5 compliant. Data attributes are a fully supported thing. You're allowed to make data dash whatever you want. The sky's the limit, go nuts. Okay? So this is our template. This is where we're going to output. If it helps you to think ahead, what we're going to pass to this template, right? When we call a template and we pass it an object to fill in the blanks, we're going to pass it our model. Specifically, we're going to pass it our model.toJSON. And our model.toJSON has two attributes, right? It's got our results and our input. The input we don't put here because the input exists separately, but the output, that's how we get the output, the screen of the calculator, right? Is it comes in, and so by passing it the model directly, we'll just always fill this template with whatever the model's current data is. That's how those two things connect. And the view is the thing that does that gluing together. It's what takes our model, converts it to an object, and passes it to our template to be placed into the page. Let's also give our calculator a place to go real quick. We could take over the body, but I find that sometimes scripts don't like it when you do that. So we're just going to say div class equals calculator, and we're going to leave it empty because it's going to be filled with our view template when it actually renders. Yeah, no problem. Cool. All right. So now, down in our script tag where we're writing all of this code, underneath the place where we set up our calculator and we registered our event listener, we're going to create our calculator view. And of course, if for our model we extended the default backbone model, then for our view, we're going to extend the default backbone view. So we're going to say our calculator view is equal to backbone.view.extend and an object that customizes it. So this is our configuration object for this new view. Couple things while you guys are typing that, a couple things that are important about capitalization. You'll notice that I am capitalizing the first C in calculator view, which I normally don't do. Constructor functions are always title case. They always have their first letter capitalized. You don't have to, like there's nothing inherently in JavaScript that requires you to do it. But if you do that, it's easy to tell which functions need to have new in front of them and which ones don't. And since constructor functions need to have new, then that's great because it means that if you see a title case function being called without new, you're like, oh, that's a bug. And if you see new used and the function itself does not have title case, that's also a bug, right? So it serves as a flag for us. The other thing is remember that it is capital B backbone and it's capital V view because view itself is a factory function. It's a constructor. And we're extending that factory with our own custom version, but we still have to capitalize it here. You could call new backbone.view. I just don't really recommend it.
Wait, which one's a factory function? Which one's a
This one is a factory function, and this one is a factory function because these two are capitalized, and because when you call them, you say new whatever to create something. And so the reason why we use these as factories, for example, so like when we use model, you'll notice we didn't have to define get and set, right? Those just came for free. Those come from the parent prototype, meaning that they come from being a kind of backbone model. So by extending it and creating a factory function, that factory sets up those like get and set for us. It sets up all the event stuff like on or listen to that we're going to use in a second, right? So all those things come from the fact that we extended the built-in, we extended the built-in function, but it's still a factory, right? You could still call a new backbone.model if you wanted just like a regular default model, no customization. Huh?
the new constructor?
The new is the thing that tells JavaScript this function is a constructor. When you use new in front of a function, it actually creates an object and then sets the this value of that function to be that object. If you don't put new in front, usually in a constructor, you talk about this, but this will be the window. And so now you're not customizing your new object, you're customizing the window, and all hell breaks loose. So we have to say new to make sure that JavaScript says, oh, I need to make a new object and then set up this function properly. If you're interested in inheritance, like part of the point of Backbone is that because of the extend function, you don't really have to know the nitty-gritty of JavaScript inheritance. If you're interested in it, please talk to me after class because it is baroque and fascinating and very different from other languages where you may have used like classes. It's not like classes at all. It's very, very different from that. So Backbone kind of makes it look classish, and the new keyword looks classical, but it's not. Under the hood, it's very different. So let's keep moving on so we can get this done before our break. So our view is going to be a little bit more complicated, right? The first thing we're going to do is we're going to specify an element that it belongs to. You don't always have to do this, but in this case, it's a lot easier. We can say that this goes with .calculator. And so that tells it like, it'll preset it so that this view is associated with that element. If you don't set this, Backbone will usually, when you call render, it'll create an element for you. Or when you render, you'll just get HTML and you'll attach it to the DOM somewhere. That's the other thing that you'll probably do. We need to create a initialize function. And so this is stuff that happens when you call new and you call this function. Anything that's inside of initialize gets run at that time. And we are going to, at that time, we're going to subscribe to our model. We're going to say when our model changes, we need to update. Let's come back to that because we don't have the rendering yet. I want to come back to that part. We're going to set up our, for right now, let's just set up our render. So Backbone by default does not make any decisions about how to render because maybe you're using Lodash, maybe you're using handlebars, maybe you're using React, maybe you're not actually even on a browser, maybe you're on a server and you have some other way to render a view, right? Like it doesn't actually care. It's totally agnostic. So the render function is something that is there, but it's normally left blank, and it's up to us to fill out what does the render function do. So to do that, we need to get our template, right? So let's create a template property of our view. And I'm going to make this all one line, but it should be pretty readable. I'm going to say _.template. Remember when we did this, right? We would template the stuff that we got out of the DOM. And then I'm going to look for my calc template. And I'm going to get its HTML. And that's going to be what I pass in. So I call _.template, and what I pass it is finding calc template, which should be the ID that you have for your script template. And I call .html because I want the contents of it. I don't want the tag itself. I want what's inside of it.
Comma because.
I have a comma because it's inside of an object. And because it is a property inside of an object, they have to have commas after them, unless they're the last one. And when we render, what does that mean we want to do? So rendering is making things visible, right? In this case, what we're going to do is we are going to render our template, meaning that we're going to call our template function to get that string of HTML. And then we're going to set the element, we're going to set its contents to be the string that we got back. Right? So we're basically just going to take that div and we're going to inject our template. So I'm going to say, first of all, I'm going to get my data from my model. So I'm going to say this.model.toJSON. And we're going to pass the model in. So don't worry about that just yet. but we're getting, this is the data that we're going to pass to our template. Then I'm going to get the HTML, and that's by calling this.template and passing in the model, right? Because the model is what we use to fill in the blanks. And then finally, I set the contents of the element to be that HTML. I just take whatever I got back from my template function and I put it into my element. Now, we have the L, we gave it a selector, and if we provide a selector, it creates a new property that is this.$L. And $L is a jQuery version of our element. As a jQuery version, it has all of the functions that you associate with jQuery. So it has CSS, it has attr, it has find, and most importantly, it has .html. So by calling the HTML function and passing in that contents, now I'm setting the contents of our div that we selected up here. I'm setting it equal to the output of my template. This is complicated to look at, but it's not actually that hard to use. Let's use it real quick. I know I'm getting a lot of perplexed looks from you guys. Don't worry about it. Let's create our view. So we'll say view equals new calculator view. And in this case, we're going to pass in an object. We're going to say that the model is our calc. That's how we associate the two of them. Whatever we pass into our new view or new model, these are ways that you can customize that particular model or view. You might have one calculator view that is the standard calculator and one calculator view that is the scientific calculator. And our actual calculator doesn't care about any of that, right? It doesn't care how many buttons it has. But it does need to be told the view that they are talking to that calculator object. And you can have one model with many views, but each view must only have one model. So that's a one or a many to one relationship. And let's tell it to draw itself. So let's say view.render. So we created our view. We gave it the model, and that means that up here in render, when we call this.model, that's where it comes from, right? We told it that this.model should be the calculator. And then when we call render, that's what actually tells it to draw itself. And so what you should see on your page, mine's a little bit off screen, but what you should see is your calculator gets drawn, right? The value of this is 0. There's nothing in the input. Plus button isn't wired up. But it did draw itself. It knows that its element is the calculator element, the dot calculator here. It knows which model it is because we passed it in. And when it renders, when we call render, it gets that model's data. It runs it through our template function, and it spits that out into its home element. And if we were to go up here and we were to change the defaults, so maybe the default result for a calculator model is 100. Then when you reload the page, you should see that new data reflected in the view, right? It should change this so that it's now 100 instead of being 0. Well, it's only if you change the results by default. So now we have these two things wired together. We've got our view set up. I can't tell which way I'm zooming anymore. There we go. We've got our view set up so that it can draw itself. It knows which calculator it refers to. They're connected. And it can render, but it doesn't do anything yet. Right? The output is now hooked up, but there's no input hooked up. So when you click these buttons, when you type something in, then there's not actually any change. We're going to set up our, we're going to set up those events in when we come back. But what I want to do right now is I actually want to make it so that right now the other thing that happens is if I take my calculator, right, and I say calc.set input 12, and then calc.doMath add. The calculator adds, right? Like it knows to change that, but you'll notice that the view has not changed at all. That's not good, right? I want it to update. If the model changes, I want it to notice that and re-render. So before we take our break, let's make that happen. That's really, really easy to do. I just need to tell this view, hey, pay attention to your model. So in our initialize function where we left it blank before, we're going to say this.listen to, and we want to listen to this.model. The event that we want to listen to is when the result changes. So it's the same event string that we used before. And when the model changes its result, we want to call this.render. I'll zoom in on that. So this.listen to is the way that you should do this instead of saying like this.model.on, because then you can actually tell your view, hey, stop listening, and it knows to like unregister everything. Whereas if you register things on the model, it gets messier. But this says, hey, look at the model. When this event comes in, I want you to call your render function, which is going to redraw the template, right? So now if I refresh my page, my calculator starts at nothing. This still doesn't work. I can type anything here, and I hit plus, nothing happens. But if I go to my console, and I set the input, and then I call do math, oh crap. The page just changed. And every time that I call do math, the model changes its results. The view hears about it from the model, and it redraws itself. I don't have to tell it, change this portion of yourself, right? I just say, look, I need you to redraw, and it'll take care of it. Pretty cool, huh? Super cool. All right. That's a lot to take in, and we still don't actually have it listening to the buttons. You know what? Honestly, like, no, we'll come back. So it's 7:09 right now. Clear your mind, find your happy place, read through this code, take 10 minutes, and at 7:20, let's come back and we'll finish making it so that not only can we get output from the model to the view, but the view can also update the model. Okay? And I will come around for those of you who are having issues. And you scroll up and you have back on video. So you have the script, but you don't close the script tab, right? You got it closed here, and your source is in the middle. See that? So to move that, see how that script tab opens and the source actually. So that source needs to go inside. Yeah, it needs to be attributed. That's okay. I wouldn't remove that because you I would move the source in if you want to keep the comments. So just go ahead and take your whole source. That's okay. And that should, I think, fix it out.
You said the contents inside the script is not showing up on the browsers, right?
The contents of what?
Like this HTML text inside the script tag.
Yes.
It's not showing on the browser.
Right. Until you render.
Until I run.
Yes. Because getting that was such a time. Go back.
I think it's so old. Isn't there one? Yeah. No, there's two more. And no. Yeah, so you would take it. Yeah, so. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Screen like, it's a point. It is. Check that out. Watch it process. So you feel that that happens. Oh.
You think about that. We'll talk about the selector for getting your template.
So if this is down to this number, what do you think you say about it? Is that help? So hang on, so look here, so expand for now, click on which one. So this is happening in the. So go back here, so why are you asking for value? When you know that our application needs to be results.
Do math. Add.
Okay. So what errors do you have in your console? It's not going to do that, and we're going to do that next.
See how it says undefined, it's not a function. It says that that's happening on line 63. So on line 63, that's where we call template. So if undefined is not a function, I must mean that this through an arrow or something. It's interesting. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put this kind of side and so your idea is how that should be fine. So I think that works. So this is not a function. It's two JSON packets. There you go.
Okay, thank you very much.
Trisha has been. Okay, cool. That's just the problem. What's your council's? Sure. No, what's your council's? Your pay. Not your pay. You're also
Except they're doing like Angular 2.9. The summary. That's just something and then just wants to live bits. Yeah. It's just something I look at with CSS as a kid. I have a buddy who's sit down he doesn't just like I'm going right now. That's not part of it's not part of the program. Part by part. 60% of the sauce. What is this? Okay. Stop right there. Yeah. The low dash. Yeah. I guess it's not straight. Or so that you have sounds like when you show this is the part of that they split it. Although that's very early on, but your activity to a guy who has that JavaScript, it says they're going to have the inquiry one. Yeah, the word that's more yeah. Yeah, we have to just go see that, so. Yeah, it just shows.
All right. So there's a lot of little pickiness, right? Like a lot of you are having issues where like you say defaults instead of defaults, or if you spell something slightly different. That is unfortunate, but it's the way that frameworks work. And really it's the way that JavaScript work, right? Like spelling is important. Matching names correctly is important. So part of what we've done, hopefully as I've gone around the room, is we've been noticing like, hey, you know, you say default, but should it be defaults? How do we check that? So one way is to do a lot of console.logging. So for example, some of you made this error, right? You had default instead of defaults. And in some browsers, this won't even run because default is a keyword. That's why it turns purple. But we might go down here and you might notice, hey, I'm not actually seeing, I'm seeing an error, right? It'll say like result is not defined. And so one of the things that I might do is I might console.log out my model. Okay, well, if result is not defined, why is result not defined? Why isn't it showing up? Well, if I log out my model, it's an object, but there aren't any properties on it. So obviously result will be undefined in the template, right? Like it won't be there for the template to spit out a result. So then I look at it and I have to figure out why that happens. And this is a little picky thing, right? But defaults is plural. One of the things that I want to get used to doing, because it's, I mean, it is a, Backbone is a extremely common. And it's not my favorite MVC library, to be honest with you. Like it's too close to Ruby on Rails for my tastes. Like I really like Angular. I think Ember's kind of annoying. But I mean, like there's lots of different things that you can use for this. Backbone is one of them. And part of the reason why we're teaching Backbone is because it's so common. There are so many tutorials. There's so much stuff built on it. You're never going to lack for examples when it comes to, and I know that like I kind of said the other thing for Happy, right? We're using Happy even though it's less common, so I'm kind of screwing with you on that. Whatever. Backbone, at least, there's always going to be lots of examples, and the concepts that it uses are really basic. But one thing I want you to get used to is instead of immediately going to Google and saying, oh, I can't figure out like why this thing works and trying to like look on Stack Overflow, let's actually look at the backbonejs.com docs. So Backbone has really good documentation. Like, and being able to read this documentation is one of the most important skills that you're going to develop as a programmer. If you can't read documentation, you are basically screwed, right? Because that's, otherwise you're hoping that somebody else has hit this exact same problem and it's been answered correctly on Stack Overflow for everything you do. And even if A is true, B is not always true, because there's a lot of people on Stack Overflow and some of them are kind of idiots, right? Like sometimes they answer questions and they give you either the wrong answer or an answer that may be technically right, which is the best kind of right, but is not actually like a good answer, right? It may be complex, or it creates side effects, or it does something stupid.
So who do you follow?
I don't follow. My point is that instead of following people, I want you to get used to the idea of how do I debug and how do I read the documentation to help me debug, right? I need to go to the source. So in this case, for example, if I were to look at, so I know that my model doesn't have the properties that I expect it to have, right? By default, because I told it that the defaults are that it should have a result of 0 and an input of 0, and it's not getting those. So I might look at the documentation for extend, and I might read through and look at like, oh, what are the things that are in here for, like here's defaults. And it'll say like, oh, here's an example of when I'm creating a meal, the defaults are this. And I want to learn how to compare that code, right? I want to learn how to look at that. And I don't want to look at it as in I'm going to copy this code exactly, but I want to get used to the idea of when I look at documentation and I really read it, right? Like you should actually be like, honest to God, reading your code. Sound it out piece by piece as though you were a third grader and you were going through your hooked on phonics, right? So you want to be sitting there saying like, apple, until you can sound out. And then eventually you can read apple and you'll be like me where I can look at something and I know what's wrong, right? But for you right now, you have to be able to look through and read your stuff and look for similarities, right? If you have defaults, or if you have defaults and this has defaults, that matters. Right? Because Backbone is going to look for a property named defaults to set up your object. It will not look for default because that's not what it expects. And you can't expect it to do that, right? Like there's no way that they can write a framework and take into account like all the different ways that somebody could misspell a word. The words that they use are important. And so I want to start building that habit of things like Stack Overflow are super useful. I use them. I'm not going to lie, right? I'm not going to act all macho and be like, I don't, because I do. And everyone does, and they are useful, and sometimes they're really amusing, and sometimes the internet is immeasurably better because Stack Overflow exists, right? Like before Stack Overflow, we had like Experts Exchange, which was basically a shakedown racket. Like you had to pay for an account to get wrong answers, which was like the worst deal on earth. Stack Overflow is amazing. But what's really amazing is learning how to read through this stuff. And I know it looks dull as dishwater because it totally is. But this is where the answers are, right? They're in the docs. And I just got back from a conference that was, I'm going to actually switch the screen share because I love this so much. I just got back from a conference that was all about documentation, and they handed out these stickers, and it's totally right. It says, read the docs. And that's what I want you to do, right? That's why we write documentation, is because that's what saves you. And then on the other hand, write the docs, right? I've got a new t-shirt. It's got that new like t-shirt cotton. It feels so nice. Like I love it. I'll wash it and that'll all go away and I'll feel really bad about myself. But for right now, like this is the best t-shirt. Okay. So all that aside, putting aside my sartorial choices, you know, as we're working through these examples and the more that we're using frameworks, then you guys have kind of seen that a little bit with Happy, right? Like Happy's picky. If you say engine instead of engines when you're registering your handlebars, it freaks out. Spelling's important though. The keywords that we use are important, and learning to find those things, because there are some things that are going to show up on Stack Overflow, but I misspell the keyword is probably not going to be there, man. Like I misspelled defaults. There's not going to be an answer for I misspelled something. There will be an answer for all kinds of other problems, but that's going to be a thing where you're going to be on your own. And it's up to us to start developing those skills to fight that. Anyway, inspirational or non-inspirational lecture aside, let's review where we are. So we, at this point, we have a page. It's got a calculator on it. We can change the model behind the scenes and the page updates. But if we touch the page, the model doesn't update, so it just stays the same, right? So it's output only, and we need it to take input. So what we're going to do is we're going to add two things. First of all, we're going to add to our view, we're going to add a new property. And this property are the events that we want it to register. We don't have to manually register event listeners. If you're using Backbone, you should not have to actually say, like, call jQuery and find things. Instead, you can say, listen, I'm going to create an events object. And inside this object, I'm going to map event and selector combinations to functions that I want to call. So I might say, for example, that when you type, when there's a key up event in the .input field, that should trigger the update input function. Which we don't have yet. Don't worry about that. Likewise, when you click on something with an operation class, then I want you to call run operation. So Backbone will look at these events when you set up a model, whenever you render, whenever it sets itself up, and it will register them for you. It'll delegate them. It'll make sure that they're all clean. They won't create memory leaks. They're all set up properly. And so whenever these so the first thing is the event, and the second thing, everything after that is the selector. When this event happens to something that matches the selector, you will see it will actually run the function that's named here. So let's create those functions real quick, right? So after our render, let's create an update input function. And I'm going to give it an event. So who remembers from jQuery, like, you can treat this as a normal event listener that I registered, right? So what's E? Does anyone remember what the value of E is going to be? Yeah, Dan.
The attributes for your mouse click, or whatever the object you click on.
Right, so it's an event object that contains attributes specifying, like, things about this event. So it's, where did you click? Were any keys pressed when you click? Right, like all that kind of stuff. Or in this place, it's a key input, and so it'll say, like, what key was pressed. Normally in an event listener, inside of that listener, the value of this is set for us to the element where the event took place, right? So like if I click a button and I need to get access to it, I can say this dot whatever to get access to the element. In Backbone, these functions are bound to our view, and this value will always be the view. So in order to get to the element, we have to use a property off this event. We have to use its target, and the target is which element did this event occur on, which in this case is always the input, but this will come in handy in a second. So we're going to get the value of that element. And in this case, actually, we are going to do it without jQuery because it's super easy. We're going to say value is equal to e.target.value. The target in this case is going to be where the event occurs, and that is the input tag. So we're saying, hey, make a variable named value and set it equal to the value of the input tag that I typed into. That's pretty easy, right? And then we're going to set our model. So we're going to say this .model.set input value. We need to make sure that value is a number What are the ways that we can make sure that something is a number? Anyone remember? Not you. You keep answering. Anyone else? Huh?
Is NaN function?
Is NaN won't help us because it's not going to be a number. It's going to come in as a string. So we need to convert it to a string, from a string to a number. Anyone remember how to do that?
Brackets.
No, not the brackets. Huh? ToInt would work in a language that is not JavaScript, but it won't work here. Huh? Times 1. Remember that JavaScript is it's loosely typed, or it's what we call duck typed. So if we treat something as a number, it will become a number. So by multiplying it by 1, you can multiply numbers, you can't multiply text in JavaScript. So this converts it. The other answer that I would have taken is we could have, and this one actually reads cleaner, like the times 1 is kind of a hack, to be honest with you. The cleaner way to do it is to call the number function and pass in the value. Say, hey, I really want this thing to be a number. Notice that it's a capital N number. But in this case, we don't put new in front. And that's kind of a weird JavaScript thing. Don't worry about it. Either way will work. So you can either do number value or you can do value times 1. And it just depends on which one you think is clearer. So there's our input. And so now whenever we type into the input, it is going to update the value. Let's actually try that out real quick. So if I go back to my page, I go back to my Hello Backbone page, and I refresh, and then I type some numbers in here. And when I go to my dev tools and I say calc.get input, I will get that number. Because each time that the key is pressed, it is setting my input value of my calculator to be that value. And if I change it, here we go. And now our view is talking to our model. It's not a one-way street anymore, right? It used to be one way. When the model changed, the view would be updated. But when the view was interacted with, the model wouldn't change at all. Now we're starting to link those two things together. Let's finish it up. So we've got one where we call update input. The second thing we need to do is run operation, right? And that's where when we click the plus, we need it to actually like add numbers together. So if you remember the calculator, the way we do that is we call doMath and we tell it which operation we're going to use. And on our buttons, we have a data op attribute that specifies which operation. And the reason that we do that is because we might want to add additional buttons that will use the same listener. And the only way that they differ is with a different operation. And this one will not work because our calculator doesn't know how to subtract yet. But the idea is now we use one function for all these buttons, and they know what to do because they'll be able to get access to that attribute. So let's get that set up. Down in our view, under our update input, let's create the run operation function. And this also needs to get an event because if we need to know which button is pressed, again, in Backbone, this value will not change. And that's how normally we figure out which thing did you click, which thing did you type into. We have to instead use e.target. And that's how we find out where did this happen? Which button? Was it the add button or the subtract button? Now we can get access to that attribute from regular JavaScript. We don't need jQuery, right? So you can, for example, if you're curious, if you wanted to get access, we could, for example, be like, and don't bother typing this, just for demonstration purposes, e.target.get attribute data op. It's kind of awful, to be honest with you. It's really long. The nice thing about using jQuery is two things. First of all, it's much shorter to get access to attributes. So I can say is equal to wrap that element in jQuery and then get its data op attribute. But hey, before you type this, other cool thing about jQuery is there's actually a special function built just for data attributes that knows about them. So instead of saying adder, as long as my attribute is named data dash, I can say data up. And it knows that data attributes should all start that way, and it'll know what to look up. So we can get and set data attributes very, very easily from jQuery. Much easier than going through this malarkey, right? So we take our target, which is a regular DOM element, we wrap it up in jQuery to get access to all that jQuery goodness, and then we use data to get access to its value. So now we are going to, now that we know which operation we're going to perform, we're going to tell our model, our calculator, hey, do that thing, right? So we're going to say this.model.doMath and pass in the operation. At this point, we should now have a fully functioning calculator. If I reload the page and I say 12 and I hit plus, you should see this become 12. And then if I say -3 and I hit plus, you'll see it become 9, right? I can add 100 and it updates. So our events are tied together, right? Our model knows about calculations. Our views knows how to draw itself and how to handle events. You put those both together, you get beautiful calculating goodness. If you are, like, if we want to be really pedantic, we can actually talk about like what each of these is doing, right? So when I click on a button, it matches this selector, right? You clicked on an operation. And so that means that it calls run operation. We call this, we get the event. We get the operation from e.target using the data function, or you can use adder, or you can use get attribute if you're feeling like jQuery, you're gonna fight the man and not use jQuery, I don't care. And then we call our model and we tell our model, hey, I want you to do math and I want you to do this kind of math, addition, right? We look at our model, and when we call do math from our model, it gets its current result, its current input, which was set when we were typing into the fields. It adds those two things together, and it sets its result. Notice that our model does not then say, hey, refresh the page. Our model doesn't know about the page. It doesn't care about the page. Instead, right, so it doesn't know anything about its presentation. That's not important to the model. It should not know anything. If you are mixing page update stuff into your model, you're doing something wrong. Instead, our view, when we initialized it, listened to the model and said, when your result changes, I want you to render. So when doMath was called, it changed the result property. And because of that, the view heard that event and it said, okay, I'm going to call render, which means that I get my model, I get its new values, and I plunk those into my template and put it into the page. So we're bouncing this stuff. Our view handles our input. It tells our model to do something that is page agnostic, right? Adding numbers is not a thing that only web pages do. The console does it. Your command line does it. Lots of places do it. And then it listens for the results. One of the nice things about this system is maybe, remember, we have lots of processes in a browser that are asynchronous, right? They take time. So what if our model had to talk to the network? So it has to like go and get new data. It has to talk to the server. Maybe it's saving a post, right? And so it takes time for it to send an AJAX request to the server and say, hey, I need to save this blog post. And then the server gets back to it after a little bit of time and says, okay, you know, I got your message. I saved the post. It was successful. Here you go. Because the model will fire off an event, they don't have to be tightly connected anymore. Right? It's not a thing where the model like directly calls render, and in the meanwhile, your page is either locked up or it renders too soon and it doesn't know about the response yet. Instead, the event means that it could take place later, right? It could be 3 seconds later when the model finally gets the response back and it updates its result, And then the view says, oh, okay, that's cool. You have a new result. I'm going to render. Doesn't matter though, right? Like they're loosely coupled. They're not tightly coupled. They don't call directly to each other a lot. Instead, we use these events to make them loosely coupled. And all of the coupling that does exist goes from the view into the model, but the model never reaches out to the view. The model never cares about what way it is being presented. It only cares about what it does internally to data. Are there any questions about this? No? Seems it's, I mean, like it's kind of a lot of boilerplate, right? Like it's a lot to think about. The reason that we do this, because this seems like a lot, like in theory, like I could write a jQuery calculator that does this, and it would take me like roughly 5 lines of code, right? Like it's not hard to write something in jQuery that does this. But when we think about the kinds of applications that are used, that we use Backbone or other frameworks to build, they are things like audio players, right? Like if you load up SoundCloud, for example, the SoundCloud is like a big thing where like there's an audio player at the top of the page, and when you click on a page and you click the play button, it loads up there and then it keeps playing no matter how like many other SoundCloud pages you go to. That's because that page goes from being a regular page to being a Backbone application. And so it needs to know, hey, I'm playing this. And so that is state that it manages. And then there's navigation going on. But in the meantime, the page is like updating, right? The model of that song is saying every second that it's playing, it's saying, oh, hey, I'm at this new time, right? Because it goes from being like 1 minute in to 1 minute, 1 second. Each time a second clicks by, it fires a change event. And that means that now the application knows, oh, hey, I need to redraw the status bar so that the tick mark is 1 second further, right? I need to update the time played. Maybe I need to do other things. I need to show that the button is in such and such a state. When you start to reach that level of complexity where you have a lot of moving parts on a page, jQuery is no longer sufficient, right? It becomes very, very messy. You have a lot of pieces of jQuery that are touching a lot of pieces of the page, but it's not clear where the responsibility is. And sometimes you might find something changing or not changing, and you're not sure where in the code that is. The nice thing about Backbone is you always know where in the code something changed because it only happens in one place. It only happens in the view that's responsible for that piece of the page. So all of those things are very defined. They're very structured. And as your stuff gets bigger, this kind of infrastructure is nice because it means that you're not having to write something to organize your code. It's written for you. Cool? Makes sense? Not just a crazy person up here? Yeah? Yeah? Fair enough. All right. So that's Backbone, basically in a nutshell. And there are additional kind of like complications that we can get into, right? Like as you start to use this more, there's an additional type of Backbone object called a collection that manages lists, for example. There are routers so that you can actually have it do the SoundCloud thing where now instead of like navigating the page, like once it's loaded, the URL may change, but the page doesn't refresh, and it uses the router to say, oh, you're on this thing now. Let me like load that page and paste it into the center. So there's lots of extra stuff with Backbone. Because I have adjusted the project requirements so that you don't necessarily have to use it, I'm not going to go deep into those today. But if you think that you might like to have a front end for your application that is more alive, this is something that I'd like you to consider, right? Like it's really nice to have this because it means that your page can be reactive and rich in a way that static pages just coming off of the happy template will not be. And like I said, you can actually load these files. I'm going to stop sharing the screen real quick because otherwise people are just staring at my weird code. So when we look at this, you know, we're using the underscore templates, but you can share your templates with the backend. So you could use the same templates to render the page at its startup, and then you could pass those to Backbone, and it uses them to update the page from that point on, right? But here's the other thing I want you to think about. These ways of using models are really kind of useful, right? Having a model that kind of sets itself up and it can fire these events, and it knows what its default values are. So it's always kind of like got defaults. It always has properties that you need. And you can do things like you can set up a model that has a save function. So then your model could say, like, when you call, let's say that we were writing a blog engine, right? And don't bother necessarily worrying about typing this. But let's say that we were working on a blog, and let's put it back. I know I keep springing back and forth. Sorry, people who are watching remotely. If I was working on a blog, right, I might have var post is equal to backbone.model.extend. And so a post would have defaults of, again, if you're typing this, you're missing the point. Pay attention. Still here in typing. Guys, seriously, do you think I'm kidding? All right. So if I'm working on this post, right, then my defaults, I probably have a title, but it's blank. I have content, and it's blank. But it should have those properties, right? And then I might call save, and that would be a function that is responsible for saving it out to whatever storage I have. So I might call fs.writefile post.json, this json.stringify, this.toJSON. Or maybe this writes to a database. Maybe it sends it to an API and it saves it to Google Drive. I don't really care. But the fact of the matter is, like, Backbone doesn't just have to be a thing you use on the client. It can also be the way that you start building your models on the server. You can use this. Just because we don't render model, or we don't render views in Happy using backbone.view, doesn't mean that you can't use backbone.model to start thinking about, oh, if I want to start building data structures for my application, maybe I could load Backbone, which you can install as an NPM module, require it, and use it to build all of the different things that I need, right? So that then if I want to add categories to my model, I can just say, look, by default, all posts should have a category array or a category string. And maybe I could add functions to this. And then when I need to create a new post, it's really easy. I'm just like var post is equal to a new post. And I can create that, and then I can set its title and category, and I can listen to its events. And when it changes, maybe that's how I save it automatically, right? So maybe whenever you update the content by getting a request or a form from the page, maybe that tells it to automatically save itself, and then I never have to call save. Maybe it can just do it because it listens for a change event. So Backbone models are cool on the client, right? Backbone in general on the client's pretty cool. But on the server, it can still actually be useful. And in fact, on the server, again, not only can we share templates, but you can even share these models between the client and the server so that your live editing interface is using the same code and you only write it once. So that if you need to do validation, you need to check on things, you write it in one place, both places use it. That's a little bit down the road, right? Like that's a little bit advanced. But that's part of the value of writing everything in JavaScript. So even though you probably will not do that for your application, like that's the kind of thing that you start thinking about when you've like been doing this for a little while and you're like, man, I'm tired of like updating both of these things. But if you start thinking about it early, like just kind of keep that in the back of your head. And certainly having your models so that they have this function, this means that later on, if I switch from JSON, where I store things, to storing them in a database, then I change the inside of save, but all of the code that deals with posts doesn't have to care, because all of that code just calls post.save. And then it doesn't matter what save does. You know, maybe it writes it to a file, maybe it saves it to a database, maybe it hands it to a carrier pigeon and routes it to Alaska, right? Like it doesn't matter anymore. All that matters is that that's been isolated and neatly packaged up so that the back end can be swapped out. And that's what lets us grow more easily so that you can start prototyping with something really basic. I'm just going to write to a file. And then later on, you're like, oh, I feel like I've got the rest of this stuff going. Now let's use a database. you don't have to look for a million places in your code to change file rights to be database inserts. Instead, you just change one place in your save, and every place that deals with posts now saves to the right place, right? That's the power of having these constructors, these factory functions that can all inherit the same stuff from one place. So I want you to keep that in mind, like as you're structuring your application, as you're thinking about how do I store my data, how do I represent it? Maybe think about doing it using Backbone, right? You can install this from NPM. You can require Backbone, that'll give you the Backbone object. And then you can do the same stuff here that we've been doing in class today. It all just works for you. And I am super happy to help, right? There may be places where in that process you're going to run into problems. Maybe it doesn't install right. Maybe it doesn't require right. I'm super happy to help with anything along those lines, because that's the kind of thing that gives you better architecture. That's the kind of thing where, like, if I can help you do that, that puts you on a whole other level when it comes to being able to use this in the real world. So please, if you want to give this a shot, please feel free to try it and then send me notes, right? Let me know what's broken. How can I help? Put it in GitHub, send me tell me on the pull request or on the commit message, tag me, I'll come help you fix it. Okay? Do not leave it until the last minute. Do not struggle with it. Never let me know, because I can't help you if I don't know about it. Okay. In the last 15 minutes, I want to do something a little bit crazy, but it's going to be fun. So right now what we've been doing is we've been writing all of this stuff in a single script tag, right? And so we've ended up with roughly 70 lines of scripts, well, roughly 30 lines of code. That's just kind of been in here, hanging out. Oh, no, it's more than that. 50 lines, roughly, of script. And normally you would not write your stuff in an inline script, right? You would put it inside an external, inside of external code. What I want to look at doing is I want to use a tool called Browserify to make it so that we can split this into lots of little files, but still only load one file in the browser. And it'll make it easier for us to interact, like I said, between our server code and our other code. So here's what I want you to do. I want you to take your model, and I want you to select it all and cut it out. And then I want you to create a new file, and I want you to save it as like alongside of your index.js. You're going to save it as like calcmodel.js, for example. So I'm going to paste that into calcmodel.js. And at the bottom of that file, you're going to change it a little bit. So this is now an isolated file. How do we share things between JavaScript files? Well, on the server, we use our module.exports, and then we require things, right? So that when we split things out into different files, we can load them in when we want to access them, but that way we don't end up with super long files. And what Browserify does is it will let us do the same thing for the client. So at the bottom of this file, underneath when you've defined it, you're going to say module.exports is equal to calculator model. It's like that. And then we're going to take our view and we're going to do the same thing. So we're going to go back to our index.html. We're not going to worry about this stuff here that's like var calc equals new calculator model. We're going to get that to a second, but we're just going to take the part where we said var calculator view equals, and we defined all of this stuff on it. We're going to cut that out. We're going to create a file called calcview.js. We're going to paste that into it, right? Huh? Sorry, you're mumbling. What? Yes, you're going to cut it out. The view, all the stuff that's the view. So like all the stuff that's like var calculator view equals, right? All this stuff here, cut out all of that, all the way through the end of the function call. You're going to paste that into a new file, and at the bottom, you're going to do the same thing that we did before, right? You're going to say module dot exports is equal to calculator view. So now we have two modules, each of which contains one chunk of our application. And we need to combine those. So we need a module that imports both of them, that requires them. So go back to your index.html. And if you're falling behind, that's fine. Just you can go ahead and watch me for now. But this is going to be cool, I promise. We're going to cut out all the stuff that we did before. Right? So now at this point, our script tag should be empty. We're going to create a new file. We're going to call it main.js. We're going to paste that in. And we're going to require those two things. So we're going to say our calculator model is equal to require ./calc model. And our calculator view is equal to require ./calc view. I'm saving that as main.js. So this here is our view. It is calcview.js. Our model is calcmodel.js. And our main file, main.js, requires those two things, right? So now our client-side code looks like server code. But we can't, like the require function doesn't exist in the browser, right? There is no require. There's no module.exports in the browser. Those things have been server only. How is it that we take these functions and we make it so that the require stuff works? What we do to make that happen is we use a new tool, and this tool is called Browserify. It's at browserify.org, and it has this magic wizard hat. It's kind of Harry Potter themed. It's like a wizard, right? And what it does is it takes files that we write using the node syntax, which is called common.js. Those are common.js modules. That's the name of that kind of module where we have module.exports to be required. And it converts them into a single file ordered correctly so that they get loaded in the right order and so that it shims the require function and the module.exports object so that they work. So to make this happen, you can see, right, there's a thing where we have to install this from the command line, and it works the same way as the grunt CLI. So if I go to my git bash, your guys' favorite program, right? And let me update this so that its colors are slightly less awful. So we're going to say that the screen text is black, the screen background is white. I know. Okay, so I'm going to say npm install -g for global, because I want this to be a command I can use anywhere, Browserify. I hit enter. That runs, it spins around. Of course, we're all going to be installing it, so we're all going to torture the internet connection in here. We'll see how well that works. It does its thing. Browserify, like a browser, and then you want to ify it, right? So the same way that we would colorify something or shrinkify, uglify, yeah, minify, right? Like you've heard of when you want to take your CSS and you make it tiny, you minify. Or JavaScript that's been shrunk down is minified or uglified. I'm trying to think of other ifies, and I'm having a hard time. It's okay. So this is going to install a bunch of stuff, right? Browserify is a big, complicated program, but we don't have to care, right? We just let it install and do its thing. Also, we're all doing this at once. Good times. And what this is going to do is it's going to create a Browserify command. When we run that command and we point it at our root module, it will look at that module and it'll look, oh, do you have any require statements? And if you do, it'll go and it'll load those scripts and it'll pull them in and it'll look at them and it'll say, do they require things? And if they do, then it goes and it gets their requirements until it builds one script that has everything you need. The other cool thing about this is from Browserify, your scripts that run in the browser can require stuff from Node. So if you have installed Node modules, or you want to use the core Node modules, like for example, the URL module, which is super handy, right? Like being able to parse URLs, or the path module, if you want to set up paths. You can require those in your browser script, and it will load them and bundle them in. Or if you have other Node modules, I actually use this to load like jQuery. I can npm install jQuery --save. And then if I require jQuery, it gives me jQuery, and it bundles jQuery into my one script. We're not quite there yet, but check this out. So again, my shell has gone back to being black, which is fun. Hang on, I'll make it viewable again for you. I love how it does that. Screen background is white, screen text is black. I know, complain. Oh, that's nice. It does it automatically. Oh, I hate myself. Properties, try it again. I will keep doing this because I care about you guys. So now it's readable. Okay, so if I go to my desktop, so I say cd desktop, which is where my files are, it's back to black, don't worry about it. I'm just gonna make the fonts bigger, and then we'll all just suffer through it together. My fonts are huge. Awesome. All right, and I'm gonna say browserify main.js -o for output, because if you don't specify output, it'll come up in a second, guys. Don't worry. Actually, I'll put it into a new tab here so that you can see. So if I said browserify main.js, which is what I named my main module, -o script.js. So this is my input, and then I want it to output to this file. And when I run that, it's going to sit and do its thing, and then it comes back. And if I look now on my desktop, there's now a script.js file. And that script file has kind of this boilerplate at the top, but you'll notice it has pulled, here's my model, here's my view, and then here's my main JS file. So it's taken all three of those things, and using the requires and the module exports, it's combined them for me, so that I can write my JavaScript in lots of little files that are easy to read. And I can write it using the same require statements that I use on the server, so I don't have to like remember, oh, my client-side code gets combined in one way and this gets combined in another. And then I run this command, or I run the grunt browserify module, which will do this for me automatically, which is awesome. And it builds a single file. So back in my index.html, I take that script tag that used to have stuff in it, but now it's blank, and I just say source equals script.js. And my page now still runs, but instead of having to load 3 files, or instead of having to write my stuff inline, I definitely didn't have to write it in one single file. I could write it in a main file that requires my view and my model, and it all gets combined still into a single file for the browser to use. So when you look at a lot of Backbone tutorials, they're gonna have you like put your stuff in separate files, but then they're gonna make you like load them like one at a time. You're gonna end up with like 15 script tags on the page, because it'll have you load your app, it'll have you load your model, it'll have you load your view, then there'll be like another view that it has you load, then there'll be some sort of utility, right? Like you end up loading all these script tags. Loading lots of script tags is a bad idea, because remember, first of all, they don't go parallel, right? The browser stops every time it hits a script, it pauses everything while that script downloads. So it's terrible for performance. Even if they worked in parallel, it's bad for performance, because on mobile, every time you have to make a request out, it takes extra, it's much slower than when you do it on a desktop. On mobile, because the radio has to negotiate with the tower, there's a lot of lag for that request. The download itself may be fast, but the act of actually like saying, hey, I need this file, takes a lot longer. And if you have lots of little files, they may individually download very quickly, but it takes a long time to ask for them. So now your page is slow. If you have one file, then you only have one slow request. And then your fast self, you're on 3G or LTE or whatever, that download is very fast. And since it's only one file, there's no slowdown from having to request all the parts. We combine them into one. So browserify, right? Being able to use this browserify command, or using grunt browserify to do this in your grunt file, so that you can write your, not only can you write your server JavaScript in lots of files and require them for modules, but you can write your client JavaScript in lots of files and require them and organize your stuff, right? Put it in modules, organize it. Don't just scatter it through like 4,000 lines of code where you can't remember what order it's in. And you have to like search for things every time you need to edit something. Put it in files. That's the easy way to work. And this will absolutely pay off down the road. So that's not something you have to do, but it is something that's super cool for you to think about, right? Now that you guys have your project set up, you've got grunt files. Hopefully you've got a source directory that you're already building like CSS maybe, you're auto prefixing it, or you're building less. This is just another stage to take, right? Not only can you compile your CSS and break it out using less or Sass, you can also compile your JavaScript that's been broken out into modules and still end up with one file for your page. Cool? Questions? Anything? No? Okay. So for your entirely voluntary homework this week, I do not have it on the page yet. I will send out an email about it. Here's what I would like you to do. You are going to build another simple backbone page, right? You're not going to do a calculator. That's super boring. I don't want you guys to get into like anything that's kind of like a list yet, because a list is kind of like a long thing to happen. So what I'd actually like you to do is to build a form that is interactive. So our calculator is a very simple form that interacts completely on the client. And so what I'd like you to do is build a calculator that instead of doing kind of generic math, I want you to use Backbone to build a calculator that's kind of like a wizard that walks you through something. For example, you might have a page where the calculation it does is it splits a bill. So if you feed it like, here's the number, here's how many people it is, and then when you change those numbers, it should see the change, it updates the model updates, and it tells you, here's how much each person needs to pay. Or maybe there's a calculator for, my cat is grossly overweight. I would like to feed her less. Here's how many calories my cat burns a day, which is 0 because my cat does nothing. Here's how much like calories are in my cat food. How much cat food should I feed her to maintain that amount of cat, or to lessen my amount of cat, right? And so you're gonna have inputs. You're gonna have maybe a button that you click to get a result, but I want you to think about, okay, so in that case, basically I have a cat diet model and I have a cat diet view, and those two should talk to each other. Pick your own topic. I don't care what the form is about. It can be about anything you want, or it can be about my cat if you can't think of an idea. But try to build yourself a very simple Backbone page where you have inputs and displays, and those two things are connected from a model and a view together. Okay? Questions about the entirely voluntary homework? The homework is voluntary. You know, I don't grade it. I don't make you do it because I don't want to grade it. But as you're working on it, if you have questions, again, please do email me, right? Like I'm always happy to help. Commit it to a repo somewhere, send me a note, say I'm having problems, and let me know, and I'm more than happy to help you out. Okay? Cool. Thank you guys for paying attention to Backbone. On Thursday, we're going to take this a little further and work with it for ourselves. So if you do the homework, you should be in really good shape for the lab on Thursday when I'm going to think of something really sinister for us to work on. Cool. Have a good Wednesday.